Oh, there we go. Okay, so great. Some desired properties for longer term Ethereum staking. Here we go. So first of all, let's talk about some successes of Ethereum staking over the last 1.5 years, right? So first, the merge. It happened. So who here remembers when the merge was never going to happen? Okay. So glad to hear you all believed it the whole time. That's really amazing. Over 1/4 of all ETH approximately is participating, or roughly a quarter at this point. So I think it's like, yeah, we're like basically about 900 something thousand validators at this point. 1.5 years of stable operation. The closest instability that we've had is we had an hour-long period of blocks not finalizing. But even when the blocks were not finalizing, blocks were still being created, the chain was still progressing, the chain basically had exactly the same properties in terms of safety and fidelity that it did a year before when we were still on proof of work. So actually, from a user's point of perspective, Ethereum has been extremely smooth since the merge. So I think big success from a technical perspective, and just all of the amazing execution and consensus client teams that have worked hard to make this happen. Really big shout out to them. So a lot of success on the technical side. So what are the challenges with the Ethereum proof of stake design? I think the main challenge that people are worried about right now is centralization risks, right? And in the roadmap diagram that I put out a few months ago, there's a section called the Scourge, which is basically about centralization and economic risks that Ethereum has to solve long term as developers and researchers in the Ethereum ecosystem see them. And basically, I had centralization risks in 2 categories. One of them is specific to this concept of MEV, which it could stand for minor extractable value. Now it stands for money extracted by validators. But like the basic idea is that it's revenue that you can get by being a validator that is dependent on you running sophisticated algorithms as opposed to just like you running software out of the box, right? So particularly things like reordering transactions, being able to sneak in your own transactions at the very beginning of a block, potentially, like arbitrage all of the on-chain exchanges, collect bounties for liquidations, collect bounties for fraud proofs, whatever, there's a long list. But the point is that there's like this collection of things where opportunities to collect money by being the proposer of the next block and having that special rights to choose basically the first few transactions. And it requires sophisticated software and algorithms that are being constantly updated, possibly even private information, to properly take advantage of those opportunities. This is a centralization risk. For the last few years, there has been this big MEV movement that has been organized around the basically different versions of the theme of proposer-builder separation. So basically the idea that the actor that is formally responsible for proposing a block, so whichever validator gets chosen for that slot, can be separated from the actor that is responsible for doing all the sophisticated optimization stuff. And you basically allow one to outsource to the other by creating an on-chain open market, right? And so the idea is basically you split the market up into these 2 parts, where one part is responsible for doing the sophisticated stuff, the other market is not responsible for doing any of the sophisticated stuff, and then you just have like an open market between the 2, so that one group just contract out to the other, and from the proposer's perspective, the optimal algorithm for them to run continues to be simple. It's just take the highest bid. Now, this is, I think, only partially successful so far. So we have seen, first of all, centralization in block builders. We've also seen centralization in relays, which are these intermediary actors that work between proposers and builders and ensure that neither of them is cheating the other. Also, another failure is just the fact that these trusted intermediaries as relays need to exist, right? So as a proposer, you have to choose a list of trusted relays. So that choosing already means that you have to have some level of sophistication that's not just following the protocol rules. So this is also a problem. Now, these are all MEV-related issues, right? Staking in general, so staking pools in general are a centralization vector, and liquid staking tokens are also in particular a centralization vector. It is important to not over-catastrophize these issues, right? Because, I mean, first of all, like on this chart here, Lido is 30.6%, but Lido is not a monolithic company. There are, I think, about 31 validators internally that they're switching that they're dividing stake between, and it is an on-chain DAO, but at the same time, it does have a governance token, and so like in terms of how you evaluate this, it's like somewhere in between 1 actor and 31 actors, depending on how like what your personal views of the thing are, right? But that's already a problem, right? Because the point of the whole trustlessness concept is that we should not have to kind of look in the internals of big actors and figure out if they're good guys or not. But like even still, right? And then another thing to keep in mind, of course, is that proof of work was not better, right? So back in the dark old proof of work era, the chart basically looked like this or even worse than this, right? Actually, this chart is a bit misleading. Like basically this gray should really be all the way over here, and it probably should be in like some kind of dotted color, right? Because like that gray, it's unidentified, right? So who here is staking with the unidentified corporation? Okay, good. I am too, right? So, who here has met the CEO of the unidentified corporation? See, unidentified, it's the new anonymous. We are all unidentified. So, the basically, the top two here, 30.6%, then 14.1%, then smaller ones. Back in the proof of work era, basically, the top two already added up to like about 48%, and then top three added up to about 60%. So, it was not better. But even still, right, this is a problem. And, also liquid staking tokens are increasingly a challenge because there is demand for people to stake and then at the same time use their staked ETH in other applications. And there's risks associated with that. So let's talk about some of those risks, right? So there is, first of all, the risk of relay and builder censorship, right? So relays can censor, builders can also censor. Then there is the risk of 51% attacks. If some actor gets 51% of all stake, then they can revert transactions, and they can also censor individual transactions in a much more robust way, right? If you're relying on or if all that's happening is relays and builders are censoring in their capacity as proposers, it's like actually not that bad, right? Because even if 90% of them censor, you just like, as a transaction sender, you just have to wait 10 slots instead of 1, and you get included by someone who's not censoring you. But if there is a 51% attack, then they can actually reorg away anyone who is trying to include your transactions, and so this gets very bad, and this basically requires a community-wide fork to fix. Risk of milder forms of coercion, right? So you might ask, well, is it the whole point of proof of stake economics that attacking is expensive, right? If you revert, you get slashed. If you stake, then the community can do a soft fork, and that only contains the non-censoring actors, and you get inactivity leaked. Attacking costs millions of ETH, and so like, shouldn't we just be not worrying? And I think a big part of the answer why is basically these milder forms of coercion, right? If you imagine one dominant actor that controls like 73% of Ethereum staking, then like they could do things like push for or push against protocol changes. They could potentially do soft forms of censorship, right? Like you could imagine them just deniably delaying transactions that they that are not approved by them by like 1, 2, or 3 slots. And then maybe it never gets serious enough for the community to feel comfortable coordinating a fork, but even still, they end up just like concentrating the market in favor of like some proprietary solution more and more. All kinds of bad things could happen. Rent seeking. So if some specific version of staked ETH becomes the dominant Ethereum-wide protocol asset instead of ETH, then that asset gets the liquidity network effects, and that asset gets some level of lock-in, and whatever the a token holder's ownership structure, whatever of that asset is, like that's basically rent that's being extracted out of the Ethereum ecosystem. And of course, just like loss of perceived credible neutrality of the Ethereum protocol, right? And this is key because this is like the key thing that Ethereum has, right? There's lots of replicated state machines out there, but there's only one Ethereum. So what might we want out of a better design? I think this is a really key question, right? Basically, a lot of this discussion has prompted interest in doing a bunch of changes to the Ethereum staking economics with an intention of making something that actually lasts and making that something that actually works, that actually is realistic, given what we've seen out of staking economics and the way that it's played out in real life. So MEV-related issues, right? So one thing that we can do is we can maximally constrain the actors that have stronger centralizing tendencies, right? Basically, so we talked earlier about how the whole point of proposer-builder separation is you split up the market into proposers, which are just validators that are supposed to be very decentralized, and builders where they're doing this very economies of scale dependent stuff that is inherently more centralizing. But as we've seen, there's lots of centralization in the builder space. There's an increasing number of builders that are censoring transactions. Some relays are as well. And this is a problem, right? So one thing that I think Ethereum researchers, I think both in the Ethereum Foundation team and outside of it, are increasingly rallying around is this concept of inclusion lists, right? Which are basically lists of transactions that get chosen by the proposer of a block. So the proposer, meaning just a regular Ethereum staker, choosing them directly and choosing them using a very naive algorithm that is basically just look at the mempool and identify things that pay fees. And include them in a structure where the next block or some very near future block is like actually required to include those transactions, right? So the mindset in inclusion list theory 3 years ago was basically that like inclusion lists are this extra thing that's there to provide censorship resistance in emergencies, right? Like they were called CR lists 3 years ago, right? The idea was that they're this like extra emergency functionality where just in case builders start doing bad stuff, people have this like extra channel, and like it's fine if that extra channel is inconvenient. It's fine if that extra channel is 5 times more expensive. It's fine if that channel requires you to pay a bunch of L1 gas even for L2 things. And the point is just to kind of protect people from being completely screwed in these exceptional situations. I think one thing that could be really interesting to look at is to basically have this like big mindset shift in how we approach inclusion lists, right? Which is, instead of thinking of an inclusion list as being a censorship resistance appendage, we think of an inclusion list as being the block, right? An inclusion list is a block, like you're basically including a whole bunch of transactions, and the part that the builder is responsible for is just the prefix, so they get to include some transactions at the fronts to collect some MEV, plus the state root. They have to compute a state root, and then plus aggregation functions, right? So that includes, potentially computing a ZK Stark of the block. It includes potentially ERC 4337 related aggregations, combining together signatures. It might include combining together proofs of different layer 2s. It's like a whole bunch of these cryptographic operations that are expensive to do, but once one actor does them, they're easy to verify, right? So basically, the builder is just responsible for the prefix and all the heavy stuff, and choosing transactions, which basically just means choosing what goes in the block, can be done by the proposer, right? So with this this kind of approach, like basically, the builder actually does become this much more limited actor. And even if the builder market centralizes much more, the amount of harm that they can do actually becomes much lower, right? So this is one possible approach, right? Like basically keep making inclusion lists more and more powerful, and like really fight to make sure that if a block gets in an inclusion list, or if a transaction gets in an inclusion list, it like actually gets executed within the next 1 or 2 slots, maximally within the next one. Finally, execution tickets. So execution tickets are the latest idea in proposer builder separation. The basic idea here is that instead of just auctioning off the right to choose the block contents to a builder and making that auction in real time, you do an auction ahead of time and you auction off just the entire right to create the slot. So what happens if you do this, right? If you do this, then basically what you end up simplifying a lot of the mechanism around PBS. You end up simplifying a lot of the auction mechanics. You end up simplifying a lot of the timing gains, games, and centralization risk. And like you're basically saying, even if it turns out to be unavoidable that this functionality of being the last actor that actually chooses complex stuff and includes complex stuff is unavoidable, that's like fine. You just have a different kind of proposer, accept that this different kind of proposer will be sophisticated actors, and you auction it off. So, and then at the same time, you would basically have, like you would have two kinds of slots, right? You'd have execution slots which do this, and you'd have consensus slots that are responsible for including consensus operations, and those continue to be decentralized. So this is one category of solutions, right? Now, let's talk about the other thing. Let's talk about staking. So why are there not more solo stakers today? This is a bunch of, a couple of Farcaster polls that I took a couple of weeks ago. I actually want to repeat these polls here. So the big question is, what is currently stopping you from solo staking? So who currently is a solo staker? Okay, if you are not a solo staker, who here is not solo staking because the technical requirements of maintaining a node are just too high and too complicated? For whom is that their primary reason? For whom is who here is not solo staking because they don't have the 32 ETH? Okay, who here is not solo staking because they really care about being able to take their ETH out instantly instead of waiting like a couple of days? Okay, who here is not solo staking because they're just afraid of putting their private keys on a hot box where it might be stolen more easily? Okay, who here is not solo staking because they want to deposit their ETH and use it in other DeFi protocols? Okay, see, so a lot of different reasons here, right? But I think the big one that dominates is that people have less than 32 ETH. Actually, it's like the exact same three over here, right? I think number one was that people have less than 32 ETH. Number two is that running a validator node is too high, and then number three is, in this case, number three. In that case, it was number two. Is basically that you want liquidity here, right? So basically, we fundamentally have to approach some of these issues head on, right? So first of all, let's talk about the 32 ETH thing, right? The 32 ETH thing was originally a compromise between avoiding two kinds of centralization. One kind of centralization is avoiding centralization from having too many signatures on chain, right? If you have too many signatures in every slot on chain, then like blocks become super big, and like you're gonna need a crazy data server just to run a node. The other kind of centralization to avoid is centralization that consists of solo staking requirements being too high, right? Like being, say, 5,000 ETH instead of 32. Now, a big unspoken assumption here is that every participant needs to make one signature that in every single round of consensus, right? So today we have epochs. One epoch is 32 slots. And the idea is that like basically there was this kind of three-way compromise that was done between not making a node load too high, not making the ETH requirement too high, and not making consensus take too long. And we sacrificed on all three dimensions, right? And on the third dimension, we basically said, well, okay, fine. We're going to have slots. We're going to have epochs. An epoch is 32 slots. On average, to finalize, for your block to finalize, you have to wait like basically 2.5 epochs, 80 slots, 960 seconds. Who here has ever cared about waiting for 960 seconds for a block to be finalized before accepting a transaction? Who here has ever seen someone else care about that regarding their transaction? Okay, so some, right? But like realistically, not too many. And I think the reason is just like, practically speaking, like 15 minutes just is quite a long time, right? And so my view actually is that there's basically two kinds of finality durations that make any sense at all. One of them is less than 10 seconds, like basically being competitive with credit card tap to pay. And then the other one is like 6 hours. And the reason why 6 hours is okay is because then what your finality level is also able to cover the possibility of bugs, because 6 hours is a long enough time for core developers to step in and make a big stink. So like either one of those finality times makes sense, but like 15 minutes really doesn't make much sense, right? There's like even lots of exchanges that just like wait, like 10 confirmations or whatever, right? So here's the mentality, right? So I've been for a long time pushing for single slot finality, right? Like basically just pushing the equilibrium towards saying, okay, fine, we're gonna actually finalize every 6 seconds, right, or 12 seconds. But in order for that to happen, we have to move away from this idea that every single participant needs to sign in every single slot, right? Like that just is a requirement that we have to give up on. Now, why is that requirement in there? Because we want to have this requirement that if a block gets reverted, then a huge number of people can be slashed, right? And so the challenge is, well, maybe we can achieve that goal in other ways. So in addition to this, other problems, even if solo staking becomes maximally easy, so ETH requirements go down and tech requirements go down to the lowest possible because we have Merkle trees and because we have ZK snarks, even still, lots of people are not going to stake. LSTs, they solve demand for this like reusable liquidity goal that a lot of people have. Also, another thing is that like we're already relying on like social pressure and virtue and things other than economic incentives to solve our problems even as they exist today, right? So, we've done a lot of yelling at people to not all jump into Lido. We've done a lot of yelling at people to use different clients. We've done, there's a lot of people voluntarily doing those things because it's good for the security of the network, but it's like, it's not healthy to over-index on those things, right? And at the same time, it's also something where, to the extent that those things are unavoidable, it's better to kind of rely on them explicitly and like be very clear that like this is where you're relying on them and this is where you're not, as opposed to having this obfuscated thing where you claim to rely on incentives, but like actually, you're totally not, and you need to do these extra things on top. So some challenge. So one solution that has been proposed is making liquidity reusable by capping penalties, right? Maximum penalty if you get slashed, 1/8. Basically, the idea here is that if penalties are capped to 1/8, then 7/8 of all stake is reusable, and you can use it in like RAI, for example, right? Like stablecoin protocols, DeFi protocols, whatever else. And this also allows for the creation of a kind of neutral, universal liquid staking token. So this is interesting, but there's this interesting economic argument, and like I have a post on this, and I think some other people have talked about this as well. Basically, the argument is that like actually, if you do this, then what's going to happen is that the 7/8 portion that is not penalized is just going to get turned into a totally liquid token, and then people are then going to use that token, and then they're going to rehypothecate it and like convert, like basically borrow ETH against it and then stake the ETH again, and it actually ends up being economically equivalent to a world where you just massively reduce staking rewards, right? Like you can basically go kind of play by play, explore what the equilibrium is, and the equilibrium of this kind of capped penalty approach ends up being very similar to an equilibrium where staking yields are reduced to like 0.5%, for example, right? And so the question then is like, well, why not just reduce yields to 0.5% and just make staking a much more explicitly altruistic thing? So one idea that one of our researchers, Barnaby, has come up with is this concept of rainbow staking, right? Basically, the idea here is you like explicitly split up into two kinds of staking, and you call it heavy staking and light staking. Heavy staking is slashable and signs in every slot, right? So if you're a heavy staker and you get signed in every slot and you drop out, or you censor, or you revert a finalized block, you actually get slashed. And if you're a light staker, then basically you only get like called up to sign once in a while, like it's a lottery-based system, similar to other forms of non-finalizing proof of stake, and whatever you do is not slashable, right? And there's different ways of doing this. Like you could have like two explicit light and heavy staking pools. You could also have a system where, as an ETH provider, you're just required to like heavy stake 1/8 of your ETH and light stake the other 7/8 of your ETH. There's lots of different ways to do this, right? And then the idea is we basically try to kind of explicitly separate out those two and potentially require both heavy stakers and light stakers to sign off on a block in order for the block to get finalized, right? So you try to add the security of both of those approaches together. So this concept of like explicitly introducing unslashable staking, I think, is interesting, right? Because there are a lot of blockchains that do use unslashable staking, and proponents of these blockchains often, say things like, oh, if you don't have slashing, then basically, your staked assets continue to become liquid. Anyone can stake, though, like there are a lot of financial centralization pressures end up disappearing. And like actually, what you gain by economic finality might be, they say is less than what you lose by like the financial centralization, and that comes with the slashable approach, right? And so the idea here is basically, well, let's like have both, right? Let's like explicitly have a heavy pool and a light pool and require both of them to sign off on a block. So realistically, if you do if you do light staking, a lot of people are going to delegate, right? And if you delegate, then a big question is, who do you delegate to, right? And is this a responsibility for decentralized pools? Might this be a responsibility for solo stakers? Solo stakers could have public reputations. People could delegate to individual solo stakers. People could even automatically delegate to an M event out of some set of solo stakers. We can do a lot of things like that with cryptography. So this is a set of questions, right? So where to go from here, right? I think, I feel like on the MEV side, the longer term future feels like it's a lot clearer than the future on the staking side, but it's, I think it's good that we already have a clear picture of one half of the problem, but I think here we really need to move toward having a clear picture on the second half of the problem. And to me, the biggest questions here are not really technical, they're even more philosophical, right? So there are short-term discussions, like there have been discussions on ETH Research and other forums of like, should we try to do a change in staking rewards in like, Petra or whatever fork soon to try to prevent, excessive staking, to try to prevent staked ETH from going up to 100 million or whatever, right? And like that's a discussion, people submit pros and cons, but like anything we do like that is fundamentally short-term, right? Long-term, the key question is basically, like there are clearly people who have ETH, who have lots of ETH, and who are lazy, and who want returns. What is the approach for them to participate? What is the intended strategy that we tell them that like this is how you are supposed to be a good Ethereum? And if we don't give a realistic answer, then they're just gonna like dump all their money into a centralized thing, right? And so I think the big philosophical question is basically, like what is the intended answer, right? Like what is the strategy that we intend people who are in this category to take in order to participate in the Ethereum staking ecosystem? And if we have a good answer to this, then I think it should be possible to build a very secure, like very robust staking economic design around it. But I think like ultimately anything we do is going to be a temporary and short-term thing, unless and until we get to the point where like we actually have an answer to this key question that people broadly across the ecosystem are comfortable with, right? So this is the state of Ethereum staking as it is now, and it's an open development area. It's an open research area. A lot of good discussions happening on ETH Research. A lot of good discussions happening on various ETH staker forums, and I highly encourage more people across the Ethereum community to become actively involved in this conversation.